In early October 2018, Wilson Alvarez took me on a tour of his work at Horn Farm Center for Agriculture Education in York County, Pennsylvania. On that land, Wilson restores the damaged ecosystem by mimicking the disturbances created by beavers, wolves, humans, and the proboscideans, elephants, mammoths, and mastodons. All of this is part of a larger effort he calls the Reintegration Project, which aims to embed human beings back in the land through the act of restoration. Wilson does this by creating and sharing the tools, techniques, skills, and community necessary to empower current and future generations to take up this task and create a more beautiful world in harmony with nature. Enjoy this walking tour of the Reintegration Project. So in all of these along here are your pawpaw holes. You'll be planting, what, 50 or 100 pawpaws?
We're planting 75 pawpaws on a 430-foot border. And then we're interplanting them with spice bush, but we're planting both of those species in clusters. It's just a much more natural approach than to have rows of one thing or the other. So we're gonna these 3 or these 5 will all be spice bush, and then we'll have 5 or 7 that'll be pawpaw. Especially with pawpaw, since they sprout up from the roots, you want to plant them close to each other because they're going to do that anyways, and they'll sort of overwhelm the spice bush eventually. So we dug these very fancy holes, much bigger and deeper than the pawpaws that's going to come out. They're around 2.5 foot wide. They go down around 14 or 15 inches. They're broken up. They're myceliated leaves on top, and then we're using the inoculant, which is just 5 gallons. We're getting 5-gallon buckets from the pawpaw grove itself, so it has the right bacteria and mycelium that the pawpaw need. And we're going to put that underneath there when we plant it to sort of inoculate this, because we're actually jumping succession pretty extravagantly here, from this really early succession, almost like annual, full of weeds, quote unquote, and then we're planting a later succession sort of pawpaw grove. So we're going to jump succession. So in order to kickstart that, we'll just add some of that inoculant back in. The best thing to do is just go into a grove and get it.
Where's the pawpaw grove that you're going into? Is that located here on the farm, or?
We don't have one on the farm. There's one about 3 miles away at Turkey Hill, which is a small sort of like jut out on the York side near the Susquehanna River here. There's a very large, old, substantial pawpaw grove there. So we're just gonna scrape off some of the soil from that grove, which has everything that we need for these pawpaws to grow, and try to inoculate. In some of the places here, you see we have this sort of old field mosaic, and then we're going to end up planting a pawpaw grove inside of it. So we'll figure out what we're going to do in between. But especially at this season, I didn't want to take off all this awesome late stage bee forage just to plant. That didn't make a lot of sense to me.
And then that bee forage and other things will wind up being pushed to the edge then as the pawpaws come in?
Yeah. Yeah, and then as we move further up here, it gets a little drier because this is channeled in. These are incised pretty hard here. But we're going to do the same sort of setup here. Pawpaws and spice bush all the way up to the tree line. And then the forest gets extended out from its space now another 30, 40, 50 feet. We're replanting that with black locust, honey locust. That's part of our silvopasture, really, but the topography doesn't really allow for those real long silvopasture lines. That will be down here, but up close it's there. So we're just making these real dense stands, and then with spaces around them for the grass, which will work more in a much more natural way.
Then Wilson, can you tell us a bit about the check dam that you have here and what you've done in order to collect sediment and runoff here at the Horn Farm Center?
Sure. About 3 weeks ago, we got what they're calling an unprecedented event, 7 inches of rain in 3 hours. And the sedimentation from uphill was so significant that most of the other creeks around here that did not have check dams, almost all the creeks around here that didn't have check dams, bursted across, and some of them actually took some of the roads and roadsides away. But we had been working on this for about 3 months beforehand, building check dams with rocks. And we had just started right before that, about a week before that rain event, we started with different type of log designs. So this, what you're looking at here, is now right on the surface, so it will flow out really nice. But about 3 weeks ago, this was incised in, so cut in about 30 inches or so here. So all this new sedimentation was actually is all new. We caught it all within this check dam here. Now this check dam was rocks that ran across here on a multi-layer because there was such a large drop. And we had an experimental log dam right there, about a couple of feet, about 20 feet. That pushed to there, which is a down mulberry, and created what would be considered a natural check dam. So it has our rock check dams and then natural wood check dam. And at the same time, down a little further, we had created something very similar to this based on this and the beaver dam. We also caught about 3 feet of sedimentation. So in that one event, we got a year's worth or maybe 5 years worth of sedimentation all at once. And we lost no sediment outside of the, off the farm, unlike every other places that didn't have these really simple logs and rocks in space.
So this was originally a rock check dam that had a log check dam further upstream that got pushed down by the rainwater, caught on this dam, which then caught all the sediment that you were expecting to be behind the other one and built this up.
Right, this is, we ended up, what you're seeing here is 2 check dams together, a very large rock check dam, and then the log check dam, which was a very experimental dam that we were trying to create one that could stand alone that doesn't anchor into the space. Now I still think there's some merit to that one. It's just, it was such an overwhelming event. I think for a normal 1-inch, 2-inch event, so we will recreate those, these experiments as we go. We're trying to see which check dams work really well. In this event, it was pushing 300 to 400 pound rocks, no problem. So all the check dams that were built out of rocks had tumbled, but since we had placed them, they still acted like a dam. Since some of them were 20 inches and some of them were 12 inches, it did lower it, but we had already put more mass in that space. So each one of the check dams, while they broke the rock ones, what did the best in there is the logs. And this one is a log and rock sort of mix. So we're now using this design over and over again because we know it works so well.
Okay. So the design that's emerged is using logs downstream with rocks upstream behind them to reinforce.
What has really come up as the ideal for what we're dealing with the amount of sedimentation is the key, the sort of the crux piece is the tree that's down across the length itself, and then the laying of these, how the tree acts as the dam itself above, and everything gets cut. So we designed based off of a lean-to shelter, a log that goes across the entire span, and then logs that are facing toward the flow, which will emulate this and will emulate the beaver, which a beaver dam is pretty much 2 lean-tos on each other to make like a teepee shape. We just redesigned that same thing based off of the lean-to, and based off of this natural check dam and of the beaver dam, we ended up with a really strong positive design, which we are calling the lean-to check dam. And that seems to be working really well. It has held back 36 inches of sediment. We had a 2-inch rain event recently. I caught all the sediment, slows everything down, does exactly what all check dams do. Easier to make, and you can do it in places that you can't move rocks. So you can, this is a human scaled version of pretty hardcore. Some of the rocks that we moved needed 3 people. All the logs that we move is like anyone can move 2 at one time. So you can get into places that are not easily accessible.
So what kind of tools then are you using to cut and create the dams?
Everything that we use in this is the Reintegration Project, 6 acres, and then there's about 3 acres of this riparian space. So 9 acres total that we work in. Everything on this 9 acres that we've been working on is all hand tools. Hand tools for 2 reasons. One, it's quiet. Birds are chirping still. I can still hear the sort of the baseline of the ecosystem. 2, we have a lot of novices that are coming in to help us. A lot of the work that's been done has been done with volunteers. So in order to use big, large power tools, there's a certain type of knowledge base that you need for that, and also so that hinders anyone helping us. And 3, it gives you that second, if you need to cut down a tree that's pretty large, that is an all-day event, versus with the chainsaw, that can be a 20-minute event. So your thought processes go a lot longer. You end up having to rethink yourself. Do I really need to do this? Why am I doing this? It allows you as a designer to sort of slow down to a sort of ecological scale, and then move into the landscape with much more purpose, other than with the chainsaw that everything sort of seems like it needs to be cut down when you have one. So
it makes the entire process more selective.
Absolutely. Okay. And time sensitive, knowing that we're using a calorically more efficient but time more inefficient. Hand tools are calorically more efficient than power tools, yet they are time-wise, everything gets scaled up. So one thing has to give, with these two things. So we know that we're dealing with a timeline that's more ecologically friendly, instead of we're trying not to create instant succession, and our toolkit shows that as well. We're going to be putting tons of extra time in, but calorically and how much energy it's taking is much, much less.
It's one of the things that we've talked about before, is about that need for time on the land. Absolutely. That I think that moving to hand tools really reinforces that.
Absolutely. And we've gone through this sort of gamut of what's the right toolkit. We went from the basic stuff you can get at Lowe's, which work really well, but there's longevity involved in those tools. And then we've moved into the same type of tools like loppers, but now we have a much higher end type lopper. They seem to be able to go through the gamut, do a little bit better work. You're able to be more efficient. So when choosing your toolkit, it doesn't have to be fancy. Anything that you can get at Lowe's does work. The saw works, the loppers work, the axe works. It's just as you move a little bit further into, anyone can do this type of work. As you move further inside of the ecosystem and understand, and you love the work, slowly building your toolkit to the best that it can be will make your work better and make the ecological restoration work that you're trying to do more efficient in general. And then this is one of our, we have a lot of Atlantis, which is a non-native species. It's highly dispersive. Some people call it invasive. I don't call it invasive. It's a highly dispersive tree. It does not form a relationship with mycelium, and that's one of the issues. It can't really hear the rest of the trees as they're speaking to it. So we chose this. She's one of the larger ones that we had on this riparian space. So we girdled her. So we mimicked what would happen if we had porcupines here. Porcupines girdle lots of trees in a stand during winter time, so they end up eating. So they're pretty much like land beavers in that way. They do not fall trees; they do eat that bark. So we girdled her. We're going to let her turn into a snag, and then when she falls, we will use the wood later on. But that's planning also for the succession of what's going to happen to her too. So she will fall. So make sure we're not planting anything that can get destroyed, because we're keeping her on purpose as a living dead. So making sure that when we design or when we plant anything out here, that there's space for her to fall later on without destroying some of the stuff that we were doing on top of that. This has become a real big turkey haven through here. Before, this was a pretty inaccessible space, the forest that we're walking into. But the turkeys have gone to exclusively use the trail system that we've made. So have the deer, because it's the most accessible way to walk through the forest. We have about half mile of trail that we've cut through this 6-acre chunk that's up here, which is some of the most degraded, invaded space that I've seen in a long time, especially with the vines. But with some of the work, we've opened up a lot of spaces, and we started adding biodiversity back into the landscape here.
And when we first did a tour of this space, you were saying that all of this was more or less overgrown and impenetrable?
Yeah, so if we look over here, this is what, you can't actually walk in there no matter how hard you try. There are vines and dead trees and snags and cuts and spikes all throughout these walls, and that stretches into the forest itself. There's privet, multiflora rose, Japanese bittersweet, American grape. There's all these vines sort of vying for space and energy. So you actually, this is what this space looked like. Everywhere you went felt very jungle-like, which is not very appealing or inviting. And that feeling of invitingness and openness that is really pleasing to humans is also pleasing to deer, which is also pleasing to turkeys. And it shows like this old growth pattern, which you can sort of trick the ecosystems for succession by mimicking old growth patterns, just the patterns of how much dead wood is on the ground, how much space between the larger trees. So we're trying to do that here. This is a clearing that we created, which was full of privet. It kind of looked like this, completely locked in, nowhere for only the smallest of animals can walk through. So we try to create these open patches, and the only thing that we do is we mimic grazers, the larger grazers, but we can mimic the larger grazers by just grazing the invasive species or the non-native species. We can be selective grazers, where a grazer would cut most everything. That allows for any of the seedlings or seeds that were here of the native plants, that gives them a chance before the multiflora and the privet do take over again, and that will give them a chance to open up. And we're not using any chemicals or anything like that. So we're just knocking everything down to an early space, seeing what comes up, and letting it sort of form its own spacing and all that, instead of us trying to tell them exactly where they should be planted and where they belong.
And it's interesting to me to be walking through this space as we can hear the road traffic in the background.
That's right.
That, you know, we're a few hundred yards from Interstate 30 in Pennsylvania,
right.
And yet here's all this space being restored, and already we can hear the birds. You know, I saw that groundhog, you're seeing turkeys and deer. And
yeah, the frogs, and we've really restored a lot of we've made pools along the way, and we've lifted the water off, and it's much more stable. I think a lot of this it reflects what's happening in our culture with the talking of consent. There's all this new sort of awareness of what consent means, and I think a lot of the way we interact with our wild spaces is domination in the same way. It's like, I want you to be like this, never really asking what the space wants. You're not really asking consent to come in here. You're not really asking what the space needs itself. So with what we're doing with the Reintegration Project here, we're trying to figure out what the language is between the human and the space and the plants and the animals that all flow through, not as a designer, as in more of a reciprocal design, where the land tells you what it wants and you sort of help with that space, with that, instead of us trying to inflict what we want on it, like we do with a lot of our agricultural practices. And we had one of the things that happens in older growth places is we are trying to emulate what the wolf would do if a wolf was here, by moving some of the carrion that is all over Route 30. We had a goat butchering class here on last Saturday. So all the offal that came out of the goats I saved, and I'm creating these nutrient-dense hotspots by putting sort of carrion along the landscape. That's going to create these nutrient-dense hotspots, which will, a lot of the plants that you see here are non-native, and they sort of rely on very low quality soils. These hotspots of nutrients where the carrion will come in will emulate a wolf kill, where all those nutrients go into the ground and create a place where only plants that are very specific to nutriently high soils can survive. So we're trying to make this biodiverse soil strata that runs throughout here. So I'm going to be moving more dead bodies in here, like all the deer There's tons of groundhogs at this time of year. There's some turkeys and stuff that get hit on the road. We're moving them in and having them have an ecological place to emulate and mimic what would happen if the wolf was here. It also feeds crows, and there's some carrion beetles now, and there's tons of, so it's this way to sort of move the nutrients that they've concentrated over their lifetime back into this ecosystem, which is a much more healthy, natural thing that would happen if we had intact fauna web. And this space here, while it doesn't look like much to the eye and probably the camera, this space is sort of a mimic of a mastodon or an elephant. This was 6 or 7 locusts that had died many years ago, and they had sort of formed this large canopy of dead. You could not walk in here, and what had taken over this entire space was invasive vines or native vines, which act invasively like the grape. So this was an impenetrable space, very similar to what's happening on the other side of the creek, which is there's a lot of dead trees that are down there that have been, mile a minute is there, and bittersweet is there, and it sort of just locked itself up. You can't even see the contour of the land. You can only see sort of the shaping of the vines, and there are some shrubs there, but they're completely covered as well. So that is what this looked like. So to mimic the mastodon, we knocked it all down, and us being designers, we can move these logs to a more ecologically efficient space. So we put them on contour to catch the water and nutrients and flow as it goes down the hill. And when mastodons, when they eat, they defecate. And when they defecate, they put a lot of different seeds in the land. So we sort of skipped a little bit earlier. We added this, what we call a biodiverse hotspot. It has American plum, serviceberry, elderberry, hazelnuts, and we put them, we just spread them across the landscape, and we'll just letting them see which one survives here and which one doesn't. We're not really putting a lot of effort into saving each individual species. The only thing that we have cages are oak trees, because they like to be mowed down almost immediately. But everything else is sort of left to their own devices. And then we're going to see what comes up, and this will become our biodiversity hotspot for adding biodiversity back into the rest of the landscape, which would happen naturally.
So this kind of becomes a nursery then, and as the succession continues here, that it will then seed further out into this.
Right, this is one of the ways of buying a plant once, planting it 1,000 times. So by making sure we're getting the best the best genetics, by allowing the browsers to come in, allowing the equilibrium with the soil to take place, we're going to get some really high quality seeds here and seedlings that we can then transplant back out into the rest of the acreage, which is a really good idea. Once we have these seeds, we can then spread them all around, and then slowly but surely let this hot spot sort of become the normal across the entire acreage that you're working in. So a lot of this we just sort of have cleared some, haven't cleared some. And a lot of the reasons why I don't clear some things is because I don't have a plant it's in a place where it would have some runoff or would cause another vector point where energy would be leaving the system without me being able to use it. So for the time being, a lot of the non-native species that I want to remove, I leave in place until I have either something to replace it with, or I can use this privet here. I can repurpose this privet in another way to make native habitat, but until I have that, I leave it in place. It's doing its ecosystem service. It's sequestering carbon, it's feeding animals, it's doing everything it's supposed to do. It's just not really hurting anything. And I know I have at any time I can get rid of it. So, but for now, it doesn't give me anxiety. I let it survive. It does its thing.
Is there anything that would give you anxiety if you run across it?
Well, it would give me anxiety in a place like this. The only thing that scares me about the work that we're doing just in general, or about restoration work in general, is making sure that I don't put my image, I'm not inflicting my will on anything. So this here is this is our largest modification so far. This spot here was cleared many years ago by a a hunter. He was trying to create a better place that was full of vines and stuff. But for years, it sat as just sort of an open grassland for 4 or 5 years. And the vines had taken over this spot. So now we have these beautiful spice bushes on each side, and they look like they've always been that way. But when I got here 14 months ago, I didn't even know that these were trees. I excavated them out. It took about 2 hours each one to prune all the vines that had gone on top of them. So we have 3 actually that have been exposed, and now they're doing fantastic. But for about 2 years before that, this was part of that hillock of vines. So after excavating what was here and doing that, you have this hyper wet spot, and it's always wet, it's always mushy. So we decided to start, which not a lot of people do, is we started to hand dig a pond. So this is the beginning of our hand dug pond. We will continue as the weather allows us to finish it. We have some locusts across here that we're going to finish across there, which will make a wattle and daub. That will just, so this is one of the places where I've made the largest impact on a chunk, but it seems like it doesn't seem like a big leap because this was always wet, sort of very hydric soils anyways. And this will act as this coral reef. There will be so much diversity around this pond here. We already have frogs living inside this very shallow little 3-inch pond that has formed in this little construction site that we have done. And then when we move around, we can see some of the check dams that we've done to sort of deal with the erosion channel that is very close to the pond itself. But this is what could happen what scares me is running into complex modifications before you understand the ecosystem. You know, you moving way beyond, it took me 14 months to feel comfortable enough to be like, this is wet. This is wet all the time. This is wet summer, spring, fall. I know that this is wet. Any little divot, even when you would step on the ground, it would fill up and pool up. So it wasn't a big stretch for me to just dig in a little bit and get water and have a pond. These are the modifications that you have to know the landscape for. So that's what scares me, is empowering people to get into the forest, which is my main goal, but having them move too quickly, like we tend to do.
Those are some of those conversations that we've had over the years about someone seeing a swale before they see the land.
Right. Yeah, that's the imposing, non-consent style designing that I think has become predominantly what people think of as design. And I think there is a different way to do it by that long observation, which is Permaculture 101, right? Just don't do anything. Just sit and observe. Mm-hmm. That long-term observation would allow you to see these type of patterns that I've seen over this last 14 months before I would make a very complex modification, like digging into there and moving literally tons of dirt from a place.
Now, one of the things that you've talked about in our first interview about the Reintegration Project was that you're working with at-risk youth as part of this landscape restoration, reconnecting with the land. And when we did our last tour, you said that this bridge that we're about to walk over was designed, engineered, and built by some of those students.
That's right. These are the 2x4s that you see were 2x4s that were thrown away. There was a Starbucks that was made a couple of years ago, and this was the extra, and they had thrown them away. So one of the volunteers dropped them off here, and they sat here for about 2 years with nothing to do. So when we started to build our path through here, we end up having these huge places that we could not figure out what to do unless we would build bridges. So after working for a couple of months on the landscape with me once a week, they helped design this bridge, which is 15-foot span, so it's not very small. It's a kind of a big bridge. It's 2 locust logs, and then when we go across, and we ended up spacing them out this way just because this is all we had as far as material was concerned. We did this with no money. We just had 2 locust logs that we found and cut, and then these were hand cut as well. These are 3-foot that were part of the waste stream that we repurposed, and we have made 5 total bridges, I think 4 or 5 total bridges, very in this same sort of pattern. But as we move and there's more people coming into the forest, we will modify this again. We're gonna rip up the 2x4s and then jack it up so it's just a little bit more level, and then we're gonna put rails along the side.
Okay.
Because it's become a permanent fixture, and there's a lot more people walking through the ecosystem. These were designed by the kids for us to be able to get material back and forth. Because at first it was just construction, just walking in, building trails, moving logs, cutting things, and now it's moving into the educational section where we can actually see what's happening and watching patterns change. So we need a more substantial bridge, but they will be part of that as well. So they come once a week still, and they'll be part of that process and design as we move to a much more stable long-term bridges.
Okay. How did you get involved with bringing children into this project from the local region?
It fell on our lap, and thank God it did. It was part of the IU13 programming, and one of their programmers heard about the Horn Farm, and he came and he asked if there was anything, and there were any projects that the kids could come on a weekly basis for. And they wanted to be able to come through the winter, which the farm sort of slows down and shuts during that time, so there wasn't a place on the farm for them. But I was already here once a week, and I said, oh, absolutely, I'll take them. And it's that other part of the reintegration work that is so powerful. It's the human part of the reintegration that I saw with the kids probably most strikingly. Is some of them had never been in a forested space before. A lot of them had never done work so physically demanding than this. When we're moving some of these logs, which weigh over 200 to 300 pounds, you need 4, 5, 8th graders to do it at the same time. And I would let them carry it together. So it would take who's first, who's this, who's in the back, who's in the front, without me saying anything. First couple times they fumbled, they dropped, they didn't understand, they don't understand their own body. But then after a while, they start to understand body mechanics, they start to understand how they work together, who's the strongest, who's not, and moving without talking to each other. One goes to the back, one goes to the front, they lift together, they walk together. That's also part of reintegrating our bodies back into this ecosystem. This is a very physically demanding ecosystem. Nothing is stable, nothing is, so you're always interacting your body with it. So that was one of the interesting parts. It was part in theory that I always knew that the humans could rewild with the land by rewilding the land, but I got to see it a bunch of times, and it's, so it was not theory anymore. You can actually see a change in the people as they get to interact with the landscape in a positive way. It makes a huge difference. So I think one of the striking things that ends up happening with disturbance in general that gets a bad rap is disturbance. The idea of disturbance always feels like a negative word, but on ecosystems they rely on disturbance, whether it be the dying of a tree, the falling of a tree, the hurricane that comes through that knocks some things down, the flood that rearranges. That's just part of moving an ecosystem from one part of succession to another. So when you look at a landscape like this that humans have for sure come in, or mammoth or mastodon or pig has walked into, it looks disturbingly disturbed. It bothers us a little bit because we're used to seeing living plants and animals. But I know from the resiliency of our landscape, the seeds that we're planting in there and all that, that within a matter of months, as this grows, you will not even know that the disturbance happened. So keeping that in mind as you design your disturbances, when you first do it, it feels very scary. You've made this huge sort of mark on the land, and you feel like you're doing something something that's not going to be a positive because it looks like this for a short period of time. But knowing that you've done things correctly, that no energy is flowing out, there's no places where water is flowing across the landscape, everything is staying where you want it to stay, almost immediately the plants and animals will come back, and you'll have a much more stable, much more complex ecosystem with every disturbance that you do create. And there's still a lot of places that we haven't gotten to, which you can see sort of what the baseline looked like. This is a very good depiction of what the baseline looked like before humans sort of came in and started getting so every tree that you see as we move forward closer to the trail system look like this tree here and that tree back there. A complete vinification of the entire forest system, where some of the trees were having such a hard time. As you can see here, we just do these simple things that seem really takes us about 30 seconds to do, but we've just erased about 10 years of growth. So this will die, all this will come down, this tree will have a chance, you know, to do these type of things. So that's a good sort of analog for what the forest used to look like. You can see here, we have a very ecosystem that's dominated by non-natives. There's Japanese stiltgrass in here, and mile a minute, and multiflora rose, and just you name it. Pretty much as far as you can see, there's natives mixed with non-natives, but the non-natives have taken over by far. And this can be a cause for concern for a lot of sort of ecosystem restoration practices. But for me, I'm not worried about it. I'm not here yet. I haven't been able to get to this spot yet. But I feel very comfortable that the soil is staying in its place. That when I get here, I can convert a lot of this invasive species back in by mulching it or doing what I need to do with it. I know I'll eventually get to this place. I'll replant this with some native seeds and seed mixes and let things come up as they may. But for now, this is a positive. It's not a negative. I'm allowing this to stay in its place, and then I get to observe it in its natural state, and then sort of see some of the patterns that come in and say, maybe I want to emulate that, or maybe I don't want to emulate that. But we're just sort of seeing what works and what doesn't. This is one of our new mastodon open sites. And this one we're not actually replanting back. So this is very similar to that first one that we saw. That's sort of a mastodon spot of eating. There's some trees that we knocked down. There's some trees that we cut. These are locusts, which we will allow to coppice, which happens in nature when things get broken. It'll coppice back up. And we just sort of open this up, expose the landscape, expose it to sun. And what we've uncovered is some oak trees and some locusts and some things that were completely covered with either vines or multiflora rose. So by opening up this space, we're not going to plant anything in here, but we are going to we're only going to control for invasive or vine species, and then allow the ecosystem to modify itself, which will create a much more intact sort of vital ecosystem that then we can then study and say, well, look at the spacing that these oak trees have done by themselves, look at the seeds that were here in the seed bed, and sort of learn from that. And then I think the ecosystem will be more resilient because we didn't choose to plant things so close to each other or not. So that's what this is, another modification that's based off of the mastodon. Yeah, this entire landscape here is just riddled with gullies. There's tons of gully systems here. These are all not very unnatural. These are erosion channels, is what they are. So we are figuring out all different ways. So anytime I'm dealing with hydrology, the first animal that I think about mimicking is the beaver. Knowing that beaver dams do all these things for sedimentation and slowing rates, and dealing with water quality. So we have some of the worst checkdowns, some of the largest checkdowns that we're building now based off of that lean-to design that we talked about earlier. Go over this bridge, and we can deal with some of the largest channeling that we do have here. This is our largest, deepest gully that we have. Also our largest check dams that we are building. Based off of so we have that same idea of a log, which this is a conversion process too. We're using Atlantis or some already standing dead trees, like we have a dead standing mulberry here. So that's all you will see in these check dams. We have a log that goes across the gully, and then we have long logs that can stretch down into the gully itself. And then as the water flows, there was a 2-inch event a couple of weeks ago, as the water flows, it slows right here. Any large sedimentation drops right where it is, and then you have this slowing of sedimentation as you go. So there's going to be a series of, there's another one being built, another one. It's going to be 10 or 12 in this space. And how you choose how many you put is how steep and how fast the water is flowing. The faster the water flows through here, I know it flows pretty hard through here. So series of check dams a lot closer than each other, just like beaver dams would. Beavers have to do the same exact thing. So studying how beavers make their dams, creating beaver dam analog that works really well for these gully systems, which we call check dams, but designing them more in the state of how beavers would do it through here using logs, and then creating them in a close enough space that as the water is flowing at its most intense rate, there will be enough check dams to slow that water and slow the sedimentation as it moves down. And we're still in the experimental phases of what it looks like, how they work, what they do, what the best strategy is, how large the logs need to be for the flow and spacing. So there's a lot to be designed here, and there's a lot of experimentation. So we've been going with just overbuilding these because we know how much flow we had, but the ones that caught the most sediment down there were half this size and half this thickness. So I'm going to keep playing with design and log size and log strength to try and get these ratios that at least can then be emulated in other places, because they seem to be working really well for us. And then when you use the eye of conversion, which is like looking at invasive species or non-native species as a resource instead of as a plague, these are all Japanese honeysuckle shrub, which you can see they let out a little bit of poison on the bottom. It creates this like single layer of just these. But I also know that this is some of the densest wood around. I make bows and arrows out of this wood. It's incredibly dense, very easy to get out of the ground, very close root system. So I'm not really worried about this. But I look at this and I say, well, what can I use this for? I can use these for stakes for my check dams, and I can use these. So then the lens of converting invasives into native habitat allows me to look at this stand very differently. That's just changing perspective. Once I change my perspective on what my use is for them, now all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I wonder if we have any more patches of that. And I know I can't get rid of this. I'm not going to chemically change this landscape so I can get rid of these for good. But in knowing that I have a use for them, it becomes a control. I can control them very much like an animal who grazes them. I'm going to need them in that same frequency. So I'm trying to emulate that. It's around 12 foot, 10 foot deep. 10 foot deep is what it is here. This is where we lost. We can see the line. We lost 24 inches or so of soil downhill, downstream. So some of the stuff that we saw in the first check dam, that large check dam, actually came all the way from up here, which is a pretty significant flow across the landscape here, because that used to be 2 foot higher. We lost those 2 feet as it went down the hill, and we caught it much later in a series of check dams. So these new check dams hopefully will catch them up here, and we can sort of step down the sizes of the check dams lower down near the end, because we'll be catching the sediment where it's created.
And the more of these that you place higher in the landscape, the easier it is to keep more of that sediment localized.
Right. And here's the thing: these things don't get smaller. These are cuts in the landscape, and with every rain event, they get either deeper or wider. So there's another strategy that we're using, which is a more plant-based strategy. We're adding check dams, but then we're also using streamco willow. We're going to stick those inside the banks themselves, higher up in the banks. We're going to create this dense root system that will keep all this intact. A lot of the willows in any of our wild spaces, at least where we are, have disappeared, but they have an amazing root structure system. So we're going to colonize these gully systems that were never really here as water systems, but they are now. So what we're trying to do is stop any more erosion and fix some of the gullying that's already happened by doing these check dams like a beaver, or doing what would happen if this was a real river. Pieces of willow would move around and it would plant itself. So we're going to be sort of mimicking that strategy by adding willow all across these gullies to shore up the sides. Yeah, so just anytime I go into the landscape and I see something that is a pattern, I look at it and I go, is this worth mimicking? So just constantly in that mimicking lens. This is a tree that has been down, but it acts like this, sort of almost like a wall or a fence. There's no places for deer to get through. It's a very simple thing for me to make. So in places where I would want them to not be able, deer or any sort of browser to come in, this is a very simple, easy strategy to sort of emulate and mimic, which is just really just breaking this down. Mimicking can move more. The landscape understands this type of disturbance. It's in the right size and frequency. So by emulating this in a couple of places where you don't want deer to be able to get in through, so it can act like if you're planting oak trees or something, for example, that they really like to take down. Emulating something like this is easy, and the landscape understands this. This is not made of metal. This will eventually come down. All this will eventually rot, and it'll just go right back into the ecosystem, and there's no real true disturbance in the negative sense. This is where most of our erosion starts. Actually, where all of our erosion starts. This is a 6-acre chunk that used to be in corn and soybean. For the last couple of years, it's been in organic hay, not very well managed. So we're just getting control over this now. And we start this same process again, the sort of consent designing or reciprocal design. We're looking at indicator species, so we're looking at the plants that are already here. We're looking at the landscape and topography. We're looking at what could be, what should be, and what is all together. And then we're saying, okay, where are the wet spots? Where are the dry spots? Where are the flow spots? And then so instead of trying to impose what we really want, we're not designing as an overlay here. We're just allowing to see what is going to come up in a natural sense and how we can speed that succession up just a little bit, because we know that we have an erosion issue. So in order to deal with our erosion issue downstream, we have to get it right here. So as the water's flowing through this landscape, we know that we have to fortify this landscape in order to capture the water uphill. So that's the only thing that we know. In order to fortify our landscape down here, we have to lock in some sort of swales or logs or run across, or some pond systems. That's just going to deal with our erosion down there. And then I think a design will emerge, because we're dealing with fortifying this landscape so it's not losing any energy. By doing that, we'll find all the little places where willow might go, or a fruit tree might go, or a native or path will go. But right now we're just going to observe it for a little bit, find out where things are flowing out of the landscape, and then fortifying that space. So we're not in the space where we're going to be designing as much as fortifying what's already here so it acts healthier and more natural. This entire thing here is eroded away. At the bottom of this is where that large gully that we were just looking at, one of the large tributaries to that gully. A lot of water flows through this entire landscape. I've been here during a large rain event where the water is flowing, just gushing down this entire landscape straight into here and moving straight into the river, unimpeded and full of sediment. So and you can see these like little different spaces where it's greener, or there's a different pattern, or there's a different plant that is growing in density. These are the places that we look at and go, what does that indicate? Was it wet or is it dry? What do we do with a spot like that? Is that a good place for digging a small little key pond, or creating a log check dam, or where's the sediment flowing and moving? And so all this is just data. As you look at bare spots and overgrown spots, these are all telling you all these indicators of what is, and then you know how to fortify what is to make it more natural and approachable in a design sense. That's not sort of like imposing your will. And you can see that's where the water flows. All this water for this landscape flows right into there. It drops a couple feet there and then sort of bulldozes its way through the forest. there is a about 40-acre chunk of woods. That's about 40 acres up there, and that's an older system. There are some oaks and hickories and tulip poplars, but they're overrun. It's very hard to get in that space. There's tons of invasives or non-natives through the entire thing, but that's a really good place for me to find acorns and later succession species that's already adapted to this soil. I can move them from there to here as seeds or seedlings and not make a huge we saw some blue jays the other day. They were planting acorns in this chunk from over there, so you can see this natural thing happening of they're moving them much further from when they would drop through gravity. The blue jays were doing that. Just 2-3 days ago I watched a blue jay plant an acorn in the forest here. So we're going to emulate that exact we're going to mimic that behavior of moving seeds from farther away and moving them closer and concentrating them like you would as if you had gone through a digestive tract. So that's what we're doing. And then we're not really focusing on that space, but later on, as our design of this 30 acres comes into play and gets more solidified, then we'll start looking at the other 40 acres or 50 acres of forest that we do have on the property.
And you'll just continue what you've started on the initial 6 acres of the Reintegration Project and continue then to work it out from there?
Yeah, and we have 30 acres on this side of Horn Farm Road. This is the Regenerative Farmscape West project, which my 6-acre chunk of forest and that riparian space, they both are in there. And this part, these 6-acre chunks, which become these key spots where energy is leaving the system and not being used or creating more problems downstream. And as we solidify what works, what doesn't, the tactics, principles, and strategies we're working with, this chunk of land will then allow us to move in that landscape with much more purpose and place and much less domination and control. We'll just make the disturbances in the right frequencies that we're looking for. We'll be able to emulate the animals or natural disturbance that we're trying to do, and that 40 acres could then be flipped over into a reintegrative process, I think quicker, because we're learning the mistakes on this smaller scale, and we can upscale it up through that larger ecosystem.
Before we return back down to the farmhouse and wander down the road, is there anything else that you want to add to our little walking tour here at the Horn Farm Center and of the Integration Project?
I just want to empower people to find places that are close to them that might be along the side of the road or near a river or a piece of private property, somewhere that has what you would consider sort of a back 40 or chunk of forest or along the train tracks, and go explore that place and become a positive influence in that place. And you can do that by very simple interactions that can do no harm. You can pick up trash in that place. That immediately gets some of those toxins out of there. It immediately beautifies the place, which makes a huge difference in how you see and how other people will see the space. The second thing that you can do is you can always put in natives. So by buying natives or buying native seeds or finding native seeds and moving them into this space, you can do no harm in that. If that native is going to do well, it's going to do well in that space. You can do no harm by adding a native. And once you, and it's a little bit more complex, but if you can control non-native species populations by, say, if you can identify, this is the important part about this, if you can identify what is a non-native species in a highly dispersive invasive species, then you can use simple lopper to sort of cut down the vine, or a small tree can be chopped down. That will give the environment a better way for the natives to have a chance to come up. So those are 3 interactions that you can do with the wild space wherever you live. Don't do this in a park where they have sort of like controls. These are these semi-wild places that we all are surrounded by. They're always on the outskirts of our civilization. They sit out here, no one really interacts with them, and they're looking for a reciprocal relationship between you and them. So I just want to empower people to find those places, begin the interaction with them, and start that relationship of reintegrating yourself back into the landscape and the landscape back into you.
And that was Wilson Alvarez. You can follow him on Instagram at Will717 and see more of his work and other projects at Horn Farm Center by visiting hornfarmcenter.org. If you like this video, be sure to click the subscribe button and leave a comment. You can also help to create more videos like this by becoming a supporter at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast or by making a one-time donation at paypal.me/permaculturepodcast. If you'd like to hear more interviews and learn about the broad range of permaculture, visit thepermaculturepodcast.com, where new episodes are released every 10 days.